Well, I guess we should get started.
Sure. Process-wise, I don't know that we've been consistent over the years, but the Chamber of Commerce has historically kind of put together a lobbying document that we use with primarily our state legislators. And we've had input on that, and in all honesty, sometimes our interests with respect to taxing authority and home rule authority may not align with the Chamber of Commerce and their business membership, but historically, they've kind of rolled that all in. Their process is to get feedback from the different public entities and take it to their board for ratification. And so that process has begun. In fact, we may be a step behind the chamber. And then there was some discussion at the city commission meeting a meeting or two ago about the fact that our interests may not align, and maybe we ought to look at our own priorities. So what Jacob's done is gone back and looked at last year's city-related priorities that were incorporated in the chamber document, as well as the League of Kansas Municipalities. They have a very thorough or more comprehensive statement of priorities. Not to say that we need to adopt them all, but Jacob and I have gone through and reviewed the prior goals or priorities we've set, as well as the League of Kansas Municipality items that might be of interest to you. This is all with the intention of reaching some consensus and bringing it back to you as possibly a resolution to share with the chamber. And then ultimately, when there's City Hall Day, we'll send a contingent to Topeka and meet with our elected representatives. And not only is it helpful to have the list, but also identify what might be our high priorities, because we have a limited amount of time and want to make sure that we stress to them what they really need to be paying attention to. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jake. There he is.
All right, I'm going to start out just by kind of taking you through the League of Municipalities. They put out their statement of municipal policy every year. This is League of Municipalities is kind of our lobbying arm for cities across the state. Yeah, I don't make that look. Maybe they're not successful a lot of the time, but they are the group that kind of represents us at the State House. So I'm just going to take you through. I'm not going to read the entire document to you. I'm going to go through some of the things that we've highlighted and kind of take a look at. What I've got on the screen is the actual document and the stuff that I've highlighted. I didn't highlight your packets, just so you had a clean copy there for yourself. If you want to turn to page 6, that's where I'm going to start at. The first section here has to do with taxes, financing and taxation. The first bullet on there talks about the property tax lid, or actually a tax lid. It says we support repeal of any tax lid. If a repeal of the tax lid does not occur, the cost of elections and timing of the budget approval process in coordination with such elections makes the tax lid unfeasible. So basically what that says is, if you want to limit our ability to tax, we want to make sure that it's aligned with any kind of a budget process, so that we can plan for that as far out in advance as possible. Next item on there is property valuation, and that bullet just really talks about appraisal fairness and keeping things straight with the way things are appraised. That's something, that one right there is kind of, you've heard of the dark store theory. I think we've talked about that a few times. That is the bullet in here that kind of addresses the dark store theory. Internet sales tax collection, there's quite a long bullet about that. But the basic premise behind that is that there was a Supreme Court case that says that we now have the ability to collect online sales tax, and we really just want the state legislature to pass a law that allows us to do that. They've already said that they're going to start collecting online sales tax, but we're really not sure how constitutional the interpretation is that they're using to do that currently. I don't think we've seen any results of that. They were going to start it on October 1st. So,
Is there anything that discusses distribution of that? Of how that's distributed?
yes, this bullet also talks about how that sales tax is distributed. It would keep it at the same way it's distributed currently. So, it's what we would prefer.
Is there any study or anything done out there right now that tells us how much we're missing the boat, or how many dollars is out there on sales tax, internets? It has to be. It has to be tremendous now, because everybody seems to shop online anymore. I mean, it's
Well, there are, if you shop on Amazon, some of those purchases are taxed at our current rate. So it really depends on the vendor and the route that you're going. But that meeting that you and I went to, Steve Steve Johnson indicated he thought that the state's estimates were exceptionally low, and
That's
I
right,
found
I
that
remember that now.
encouraging. But then he said the number he saw was 20 million, and he thinks it's probably 40 million. Well, the analysis I did for you a while back was off the state's estimate of 40 to 80 million. So to hear him say that he'd heard a $20 million projection and he thought maybe it was 40 caused me a little bit of concern. But other than numbers just thrown out, I haven't seen anything with methodology behind it.
Well, and you said we have the ability to start collecting sales tax. What do you mean? Who has the ability to, the state or?
So the state.
It's the state, not
Department of
not
Revenue is
local
who-
anything.
Yeah, they actually collect the sales tax and then they remit it back to the city. So it's the same makeup as it is today, only they're saying now they can collect some of those online sales tax that they weren't in the past.
Yep.
So we haven't seen the results of that or the impact of that just yet, and we're not sure how that's going to stand up legally, whether the way they're collecting it actually meets the intent of the Supreme Court case. So.
So what's the difference between Kansas and some of the other states that are collecting those taxes? Why would it be
Right,
unconstitutional
so
for
the
us?
Supreme Court case, there are limitations on who you can collect state sales tax from, or that sales tax from out of state. So that it's things like the amount, the number of transactions, and the amount of sales tax that would be collected. So the intent there is if you have somebody that's doing 5 or 6 sales a year outside of that are into the state of Kansas, that wouldn't follow the Supreme Court case. If you had somebody that was a lower dollar amount, I think the threshold was $100,000. If they didn't have more than $100,000 of sales in Kansas, we couldn't collect that. The interpretation that the Department of Revenue has taken is that we can collect anything. So there's no limitation. So we're not sure if that's going to actually be held.
If I might throw something in,
Sure.
on the previous system, or the system that I guess is still in place now, the reason we have to pay taxes when we buy from Amazon is they have a location in the state. They call it Nexus, and so if somebody has a Nexus in the state of Kansas, then they are required to comply with the Kansas sales tax laws. So,
Yeah, well, then
So
on top
so
of
we're already collecting those. So they have a
we're
building,
getting
they have bricks and
some,
mortar, then
but-
we are
Well,
collecting.
but on top of that, you can be a vendor where Amazon is kind of your backup house. So
Yeah.
depending on the individual vendor you're buying from, if you're buying from Amazon direct, then they have a brick and mortar
That's true.
location. If you're
Yeah.
buying from a vendor that's using Amazon for their order fulfillment, then it's a question whether they have a brick and mortar location. And the South Dakota versus Wayfair was the national decision that said internet online sales tax are constitutional nationally. A lot of states then went back and passed state legislation to implement it. Kansas didn't, and they got tangled up in other taxation legislation last year and died. And so then the Director of Revenue, after all, they started into it thinking they needed legislation. Then the Director of Revenue said he believed he had independent authority to impose it, as Jacob described, rather than imposing it like most other states or the Supreme Court decision. He said every sale is subject to it, which then just sets it up for a legal challenge. So we might be able to collect it without any further legislation. If the state would pass the legislation, it would clean it all up.
Fun stuff.
yeah.
The next item on there is just about general tax policy. I'm going to read this one to you because it's a little long. The League supports long-established philosophy of balancing revenue from income, sales, and property taxes to ensure the fiscal ability of the state and local governments to provide the services citizens want and need. Changes to tax policies should not be undertaken without a full understanding of the overall impact upon all taxpayers, tax entities, and sources and the amounts of tax revenue. And basically what that says is we don't want you to make some kind of a change at the state level that's going to have second and third order effects down here at the local level. And that's, I think, probably that statement right there is a result of the property tax lid, or things like machinery and equipment property taxes, where they basically said you can't value machinery and equipment the same way you used to. And I think that was probably 2008, 2009, and it was about $1 million swing for the city of Salina at that time. So, I mean, they make decisions, and they can have a really big impact on what we do here. So we would prefer them not to make those big decisions without thinking about those things. The next item on there is property tax exemptions, and basically that one is about not allowing too many exemptions for property taxes. The more exemptions they allow, like machinery equipment property tax, that just has an overall effect on our property tax, and it has a shifting effect from one classification to another. Sales tax exemptions is the same way. We prefer that they don't provide a lot of exemptions on the sales tax side. The more exemptions that they provide, the less amount that we're able to collect. And I didn't scroll down, so
No, it wasn't.
that's actually on the next page. And there's a bullet there that talks about unfunded mandates. Obviously, we prefer that the state doesn't put mandates on us that they don't provide funding for us to be able to handle. I'm going to flip down to the next page here. Banking and investment restrictions. This bullet basically, we would like to be able to use our finances and the money that we have and earn as much interest as we can, and the more tools that we have to be able to do that, the better off we'll be.
Mike, I don't remember when we were at that meeting, did they mention anything about the food sales tax, about abolishing or trying to get rid of the food sales tax?
Well, my recollection is Steve Johnson acknowledged it's a topic of conversation, but the state can't afford something like that right now.
Well, no, we can't either.
Right, it hit their bottom line too significantly. And it is a topic that we actually had as something we supported in years past, and our comment was that to offset it with online sales tax. But now, seeing the numbers we're seeing, I'm not sure it's even close that one would offset the other.
I think the food sales tax exemption, depending on how it's implemented, and there's lots of different ways to do that, probably somewhere between $4 to $6 million for the city per year, I would guess.
And there's no arguing that it's regressive, but everything we're talking about has a destabilizing effect on our economy and our budget, and it doesn't make the expense go away, it just shifts it in another direction. And I'm not even sure I can tell you where it might end up.
The league's statement does not address that at all.
Okay.
And we will talk about that a little bit more when we get to our actual policy. So, and I'm going to skip forward here to page 12. There's really nothing too significant on these infrastructure or public safety pages that I wanted to go over. So right there, recreation trails, we support the development of this is something that we've seen over and over in our park master plan surveys of the public, that they're interested in doing some kind of trail system. So we support any kind of infrastructure support for those trails. And then down on utilities, talk a little bit about franchise authority. We would oppose any legislation that would restrict our ability to change, or that would change our current authority for franchising. And the next one is right-of-way. This is basically deals with our ability to control utilities and things in our right-of-way. Over the last several years, there's been some changes in state legislation that has kind of limited our ability on some things. A lot of the telecom type companies that are bringing in cellular phones or small cell, we've been limited in our ability to recover costs or require them to pay us in certain circumstances. So
We've also been limited in our ability to regulate poles and hardware and equipment on poles, and we've seen that. Locations that the citizen expectation is we have more oversight than we do, and they get very frustrated with a location in their neighborhood, and they're surprised to find out we have little to no oversight.
I'm going to take you forward to page 14. This bullet's about capers and KPNF, and obviously as employees, we prefer that the state would fund the capers and KPNF system as fully as possible. There have been some times in the recent past where they've not made full payments to capers and KPNF. That was a personal one that Mike threw in.
I did highlight it, but it has the repercussion of going unfunded, or we as a city contribute as well, and our contribution rate is calculated, and at some point they might start shifting burden from the state to the localities to pick up more of that burden.
And the more they change things like KPNF, capers, it limits our ability to hire people. I mean, that's a big part of our benefits package. If those things are eroded, it makes it more difficult.
Actually, it's not all that recent. It's been going on for decades.
Oh, the
No.
holdback? Oh, yeah. And we talk a lot about the bank at KDOT, but the other item has been just withholding funding of capers and KPNF.
On page 15 there, this bullet talks about home rule authority. Consistent with the Home Rule Amendment, the Kansas Constitution approved in 1960, we support local elected officials' decision-making in their community. Basically, home rule authority is something that allows us to do a lot of things we do kind of aside or outside of state law. So we don't want them to change that or erode our ability to make changes and do things at the local level. City elections there, that talks about not allowing city elections to be partisan. There has been a big push in the last couple of years to change local elections to partisan elections, and we prefer for that to stay the way it is. And that's really maybe not as big a deal here in a larger community, but in smaller communities where they really have a hard time getting people to run. Having to put that D or that R by your name really affects those guys from throwing their name in the ring. The next page there, this bullet is about sign regulation, and basically what it says is that we support having the ability at the local level to regulate our signs. So we prefer the state not come in and make rules and regulations about that above and beyond what the federal government has already done. So we're going to talk about signs again later in the regular meetings. And then the next bullet we have highlighted there is governmental immunity. We support continued immunity for cities from tort liability legislation strengthening the Kansas Tort Claims Act. Then down to the next page, this section is about community development, and these are things, kind of economic development, community development items. Abandoned and blighted housing. There's processes for getting rid or taking care of abandoned and blighted housing, but they're long and drawn out. And there's been a push for the last couple of years as a legislator to try and expedite those processes. So if you do have abandoned or blighted houses and you know about them, that you can go through that process much more quickly. Those haven't really made much traction in the last couple of years, but we would support the ability to take care of some of those things much more quickly than we can today. Tax abatements. This is we support the authority of the cities to offer tax abatements for economic development. Tax increment financing, revitalization tools, star bonds, these are kind of all in the same wheelhouse. We really want the ability to provide incentives in a way that we think is most effective for our community. So we prefer that the state doesn't change things, or if they do change things, they give us some lead time and they don't cut our knees off. I think that is all for this
We get
document.
Housing rental
Or
inspections.
inspections,
Oh,
yeah, you missed.
And that's bounced back and forth. If you followed Lawrence or Hutchinson, they attempted it and repealed it, and it's been challenged whether it was constitutional. Governor Brownback, his administration opined that it wasn't. So some clarity about housing rental inspections would be a good starting point, and just the ability for cities to do that. And that's very much a local decision.
So that would be a city by city, not a state mandated.
I thought Lawrence still had theirs.
Well, maybe I'm thinking of Manhattan.
Manhattan.
Yeah, that's right.
Manhattan's
Yep.
on there.
Lawrence
Yep.
is trying to do it, but they're finding it to be, I think, a challenging task. They were going to try to inspect all their rentals within, I think, on a 4-year cycle. Well, the first year they did like 800 out of 19,000, so they're not making their 4-year cycle.
Well, and the Brownback administration passed legislation that made it a privacy issue, and that you could not go into an occupied residence to inspect it. And so I think Hutchinson pulled back on that basis, and then Manhattan was purely political. They attempted it and met with so much
And
opposition.
Lawrence has
they
some
repealed
way
it.
of working around that.
I'm
They
not
say
sure.
that it works around it.
Yeah,
I
I've
don't
yet to
understand.
see how you do that, given the current legislation.
Yeah.
So that was the league's statement of policy, the things that they're gonna be interested in looking at the state level. And if there's anything in there, as you guys look at that, that you think we need to focus on a little bit more, we can certainly add anything to our local policy, but that is what the league kind of will be looking at. So now I'll take you to the second document that you have there. And as Mike said, this has been in the past, this has been part of a larger document that's approved by the Chamber of Commerce. And what we'll do with this is we'll go through it, and if there's, if you guys are okay with it, if the things you want to add, we can put those in, and then I will shoot this over to the Chamber. The Chamber's actually discussed it last week on Wednesday with their board. They kind of went over the high level. Now the Chamber's document has input from the school system and from K-State and from the airport authority and all the entities kind of together. And what we'll do after that, once it's all put together and combined, we'll set up a time to meet with all of our local representatives. And then basically I think what we do is kind of sit around a table when we go through the whole document. But this will be the kind of the one document that they can grab onto and say this is what the city of Salina overall is interested in. So I'll start there at the top, and I'm going to go through each one of these, just so, because this is kind of a little bit more focused approach. But Star Bond and TIF, this is something that's been in our document for several years, and basically this item says that we support the use of Star Bond and TIF, and we don't want any changes, particularly to those people that have already put things in place. Since we have a Star Bond and TIF district that's pretty complex, we don't really want the state making any changes to what we have going on right now.
And the rest of that story, as you probably recall, is for 2 or 3 years running, we were worried that legislation was going to get passed before we could get our district in place. This is the first year that, you know, we have it behind us. We could strike this all together, but instead we edited it just to reflect that, you know, there's a lot of time and energy invested before you ever get full approval, and if they're going to change anything, in fairness to other communities, they ought to at least take that into account. So thankfully, we don't have to sweat it out anymore.
The next item on there is Home Rule Authority. As we kind of talked a little bit, we support the state of Kansas preserving the Home Rule Authority for Kansas cities with regard to taxation and governance. There is a bullet there. The second bullet says Salina County favors extending constitutional protection for the county. We actually have already talked with the county about some of these items, and since this will go into the Chamber's more broad document, that's in the local government section. So Salina County asked that we put a bullet in there that just says they would like to broaden their home rule. I think their home rule authority is not as broad as the cities, so they would like that to be something that, I don't know that there'll be any changes to that anytime soon, but they at least want to put it in there. And then the next item is sales tax. Basically, this one talks about keeping sales tax at the current level, and then if there are any additional or changes to sales tax that we keep and continue to go through with the same formulas as before. And also, with sales tax being the way it is, we prefer that the state doesn't increase their sales tax because they're already a pretty large percentage of what we collect, and so anything that they do affects what we have at the local level. Then we have a little section here about internet sales tax. This is basically our take on things with internet sales tax, but it's very similar to what's in the statement of municipal policy for the league. The next item on there is sales tax on food products, and this is a byproduct of what was in the document last year. It says, with the financial impacts of sales tax in mind, the city of Salina also supports the state of Kansas considering the elimination of sales tax on food products. We strongly believe this tax creates a disproportionate tax burden on lower income families. If sales tax is reduced or eliminated on food products, it will result in significant fiscal impact for local jurisdictions, which have already been negatively impacted by several state tax policies. Then it says we would support offsetting that with online and internet sales tax. So that's an item up for discussion. If you want to keep that in there or throw that out, it does have a dramatic impact on the city's finances. If they were to repeal food sales tax, we would have to really think about how we do things and shift things in another
Because didn't you just say a second ago that the difference between the internet sales tax and the food sales tax is so dramatic that it wouldn't even cover, the internet wouldn't even cover the food sales tax?
We don't think it would.
I'm the one that tagged that last sentence on last year before we knew, and we thought internet sales tax might account for a lot more than we think that it does now. But I'm repeating myself, but I don't want to lead any of you to believe that the online sales tax would come anywhere close to offsetting the impact we feel from removing our share of the sales tax on food.
Well, the part of that I don't really care. It says consider the elimination. It doesn't, and we don't talk about that happening over a period of time. I mean, we see what happened when we quit collecting, you know.
Machinery and equipment.
Yeah, well, and then also when we stopped taxing LLCs and corporations.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, you can't have a knee-jerk reaction and just stop it all at once. I have a problem with that paragraph because we don't go into enough detail of,
Well, it does talk about phased implementation, but even that, if there's not an offset.
yeah, you got to figure out what your offset is. Not only the state, but at the local level. I don't know how you would do it.
We can certainly make adjustments, or we could remove it altogether. I mean, it's really
I understand the philosophy behind it, but I don't
Yeah.
understand sitting here as a commissioner, I'm not sure how we are able to offset that without having putting quite a burden on our budget.
This was a last minute addition last year, and I'm not sure there was a good answer to it either way.
just want to take it out.
I'm
Let's
okay
take it
with
out. I'd take it out.
It's admirable to do something about the sales tax, but for on the food, but it's been traditionally built in. I just don't feel like the offset that whatever offset exists for internet taxes, whether it applies in a substantial way or not, that's revenue we're foregoing anyway, and we ought to be getting, and it's really, we're picking something that we think is a better progressive idea to do, to substitute that revenue into, but really, we deserve the revenue. We've been,
For any of the proposed plans for sales tax on food, was it just edible? I mean, let's say if you want to buy Ajax liquid, that would still be taxed. But
Yeah, just
It
food
would
only, it's
truly be-
consumable
And
food.
food and.
Well, there are a lot of different implementations. In some areas, you go walk into McDonald's, and if you buy
Yeah.
at the counter to eat in the restaurant, it's not taxable, but you do the drive-through, it is, or vice versa. The idea, I think it's reversed, because the idea you're driving through the drive-through, you're taking it home, and so it's groceries. So there's lots of implementations that,
The one.
that's what makes it so hard to decide what it's gonna be, how much.
Yeah, the one thing that I can tell you is we probably need to pay close attention. If any of that legislation starts to make headway, then that's gonna be the opportunity to size it up. The league's gonna be sending out notices, and as we know more about implementation, we might be able to figure out where we stand on it. But if it's just a wholesale elimination, it'd be very destabilizing for us.
unless it occurs over a 10-year period.
Mhm.
Because it's, I'm assuming, you know, a lot of states have not had it for decades.
Mhm.
You know, so
They-
they've constructed their budgets.
budget
to-
around that, right? Yeah.
Because 10% gets to be a repressive tax on, if you don't have much money and you go to buy food. I mean,
The other thing that's
Nebraska's that
unique
way,
about
too.
Kansas is all the other sales tax exemptions that we have in place. In a
Yeah.
graduate level class I took a while back, the professor and a former intern of ours had inventoried all the sales tax exemptions, and they said 90% of our sales tax base was exempted.
What would go,
Already.
and again, if you were trying to, you know, give and take, what would property, you know, the property tax, if that was re-implemented, what would that do to the balance sheet?
The
Machinery and stuff, yeah.
Real property.
Real property, yeah.
Boy,
I mean, that would be a way to go, you know, if you were to
I don't
start
think-
implementing
I
that.
don't think it would touch sales tax on food, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it was about $1 million
Yeah.
swing 8-9 years ago.
Yeah.
So maybe a couple $1 million.
But again,
Six.
you maybe aren't able to you know, and again, this gets into all that negotiating they have to do at the state level, but you wouldn't completely do away with sales tax on food. You would reduce it by
Right.
2% or something. But you're going to have to find that offset, whether it's machinery, property tax on machinery coming back or something, you know. But
Just tax Girl Scout cookies. I know it's unpopular.
you said that,
Well, no, but that's an example of something that's exempt.
right?
I mean, if you're gonna buy Girl Scout cookies, you're gonna buy them whether they charge tax or not. Because it's not the price of the cookies, you're giving money to the
There
Girl
are
Scouts.
literally hundreds
Yeah.
of exemptions,
Yeah, I mean, if,
you know.
and we've had this conversation with Steve Johnson before, that he'll be quick to acknowledge the exemptions are there, but there's too many vested interests to really open that can of worms. But if you're really gonna do it, in my estimation,
You've got to open that box.
you have a pretty thorough review and reset of our tax base.
Hopefully I don't have 500 young ladies at my front door tomorrow morning. Just using it as a quick example. I have to leave early for work tomorrow.
I keep using the term destabilizing, but I really think that's probably a mantra we might want to take up with our legislators is, in a vacuum, you can make any one of these decisions, but your past decisions and your potential future decisions can be very destabilizing to our local communities. And wait till we get to dark store property valuation. That
So we're
just
gonna remove
underscores
that.
that point.
Well, and if they feel that strongly about it, their sales tax is 75% of sales tax, just take the state sales tax off. And that's gonna help tremendously.
To Commissioner Hopping's point, they have historically made some taxing decisions without a good sense of the consequences and
I guess my reason for not wanting to remove it is the conversation dies. I don't expect it to go anywhere, but
well,
I just like to keep, and I have no objections to removing it, but it's just
well, I think the conversation is gonna continue at the state level, and we'll have an opportunity to monitor it and, weigh in.
The only way I would leave it in is if you worded it such that we support the reduction in sales tax on food with a proportionate increase in some
alternate
revenue source
Yeah.
that's exempt. I mean, that
I like that.
would, that way they know we're thinking about it, but yeah, they've got to take into consideration the budgets of not only this city, but others, so.
I like that wording
Okay.
a lot. Thank
Is
you.
that acceptable to one more of you?
Right.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm okay with that.
I mean, folks have to realize if you want government services, you gotta pay for them.
I guess I just look at it as real black and white. If you really wanted to make the decision to not charge those taxes, then you'd look to the community to say, how much can you stand us to raise a mill levy? And we'll just take that off of the local tax. But that's not a conversation that is gonna fly.
Or change the basic sales tax rate to accommodate it. Everybody else just pays a little more.
Right.
I mean, there are trade-offs to be had.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's what stopped the discussion in past years, is the state
Nobody
have
wanted to
never-
give up.
has never found any of those really palatable.
All right, the next item there is property tax lid on counties and municipalities. We support the state of Kansas repealing prior legislation establishing a property tax lid on municipalities. This kind of goes along with the home rule authority and our ability to manage and shift things at the local level. And that's something that's been in here for a couple of years. The next item is dark store property valuation. We would support proven techniques to determine commercial property values at the highest and best use, using all three methods of valuation: cost minus depreciation, sales comparison, and income. So I think we've talked about dark store theory several times in the past in here, but the main thing is we don't want them to value Walmart the same way they would value an empty Kmart store building. That would affect us dramatically.
And the concern is they've been successful all the way to the Board of Tax Appeals in other counties. So I think the argument's building momentum and may actually take some proactive legislation, which I don't know if the legislature's brave enough to do it.
Who's been successful? I'm sorry, Mike.
Johnson County.
Yeah, Johnson County, was it Target that took their appeal all the way to the Board of Tax Appeals, and the Board of Tax Appeals.
Because they use the
Agreed.
income basis? Is that what
Yeah,
they used?
Target prevailed with the dark store theory of taking the income basis out. And then Hannah Standby indicated when we met just recently that there's 2 other counties that they've gone to and been successful, taking it to the Board of Tax Appeals. And my concern is they're going to the larger counties and proving up their case, and then they just start working their way through the state. If that, I probably don't need to point out, if that tax base goes away, to Commissioner Ryan's prior point, if you try to adjust tax rates accordingly, it's going to shift most likely to residential property values. And that one, to me, this is the most significant, most likely impact on us locally at the moment. And, then in reading their justification, they make a pretty compelling analogy that resonates with me a little bit, and that is, if I win the lottery today, my house isn't worth any more than it was yesterday, and if I go bankrupt today, my house isn't worth any less. On its face, that's a pretty compelling argument, and if they can prevail, they haven't even tried to quantify the impact on us locally.
Except it's not their house, it's a business.
I understand, but what they're trying to do is say it doesn't have anything to do with income. We're the only people that need a building this big, configured this way. If we leave, we might be able to parse it out into, bits and pieces, but it will never be worth what it is because we built it for our purpose. And right or wrong, they've been successful at the Board of Tax Appeals.
Next item on there is vacant lot property valuation. This is new this year. This says we would support efforts to ensure that vacant properties within city limits that is served by municipal services, water, sewer, and streets is assessed as vacant property rather than agricultural property.
And that's directly out of the recent conversations we've had. That's up there for your consideration of whether that is the approach you want to take.
And of course, at the meeting we went to, we talked to
Steve Johnson?
Steve Johnson, and his deal was that being election year and everything else, that he just doesn't see that moving at all.
Yeah. Well, actually, Steve Johnson, that was Eric Sartorius, the director of the league, that was his immediate reaction.
Okay, that's
Steve
right.
Johnson initially kind of acknowledged he understood the concern and was supportive, and then as the night went on, it was maybe you want to champion that and coordinate with Johnson County, and rather than him taking it on as an issue that he would advocate. But as we've reported to staff previously, if it is a concern, I don't believe it's a local figure. I don't believe the appraiser is doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
It's consistent with statute and guidance, and there's some inconsistency across the state, but it's very discretionary and based on what the property
I
owner
like it,
serves.
'cause I mean, we're talking about property in a city. The expectation is that property will be used either commercially or residential. There's no expectation that that's really gonna become a farm anytime in the next 10 years. I mean, it's temporarily vacant is what it is. But still subject to upkeep as far as city expenses are concerned. Well, we've been first before in Salina.
My feeling is we should take it out of there. I don't think that it's worth the staff's effort at the time when it's more of a statewide issue.
Well, and that's what we're doing. We're taking it to the state, so it really is out of we're just saying this is something for them to.
I mean,
Are there other counties that are addressing this that we're aware of? Did you say Johnson
I'm
County?
aware of some that challenged it to the Court of Appeals. I mean, they've wanted this outcome, but I can't tell you in terms of lobbying and legislation what's going on.
Sometimes when nobody comes up to complain, folks just assume everything is hunky-dory and they don't change anything. And you may find 85 of the counties, yeah, that's right.
Well, I'm not so sure if some aren't fatalistic about it, that it's been this way for a long time and it's not gonna change, but.
I think if we push the conversation out there, there's a lot of people who realize they're paying more than they should, and they'll go back to try and get the agricultural designation, so that they can get the lesser tax.
Yeah, but we're talking, what, a couple $100 a year?
Well, either way, it's fairly insignificant to our overall budget, because you set your budget, you put this in, so, you look at what it does to every individual taxpayer in the community that's a property owner, and you're talking very, very minimal adjustment, so either way, but I'm okay with leaving it in and
Yeah,
letting the state deal with
If you're paying a
it.
higher tax on a piece of vacant property in town, I hope sooner or later you get motivated to put that property back into use. I mean, tax values in a larger city, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars difference if that property is vacant as opposed to has a house on it. Of course, the house is going to have a tax value, but vacant property in Washington D.C., I mean, you might as well just go give your firstborn kid up because it's taxed at a wicked rate. But that's the way to get that property back into use quickly.
Sounds like three of you are supportive of it being in.
I mean, the whole thing's a wish list. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll sink our resources probably in two or three of them. But
And I'm gonna jump ahead of Jacob a little bit and tell you the next three of these are probably more philosophically driven than likely to get results, but they've been topics of conversation for quite some time.
Yeah, so building security, we support legislation that would place building security authority back with local governments. There was some state legislation that required changes in the way security works for local government buildings. And that has to do with concealed carry, open carry, that sort of thing as well. There hasn't been any movement on this in a couple of years, and it really hasn't impacted us greatly. I think here in this building, you'll see the metal detectors and the way they changed how you get up to the third floor has been the impact, but it's not really had a huge dramatic impact on most local governments. I don't think it's, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. I don't think that's been a topic of discussion for a couple of years. So we could take it or leave it.
well, if it's a wish list, I'd leave it. But if something else gets knocked off the list, I mean, it's an expendable one. I never liked the law to begin with.
The residential fire sprinkler preemption is the same thing. Several years ago, it says about 7 years ago, the state of Kansas adopted a law that banned cities and counties from adopting and enforcing single-family and duplex residential building sprinkler requirements for new construction. This is another that goes kind of back to home rule. This is the state of Kansas preempting our local authority. And that has not been a topic for several years at the State House either.
I'd keep that in. I mean, the state's gonna, no, you cannot do something that's gonna keep you safe. Sorry, not in our state. That's just reprehensible that we let you think that you could do that. That's how Kansas gets on the Tonight Show. Rules like that.
Well, I think that was the result of an effective
Yeah.
lobbying group to get there. But, having
And
been
it wasn't
involved
the
with
fire sprinkler salespeople.
Yeah.
having been involved in codes a lot, my philosophy may be different than others, but I would welcome a statewide code. If they want to weigh in, just set it across the board, and then you don't have all the local amendments
Don't
and
have to worry about it.
differences from one community to the next. But they haven't done that. They just jump in topic by topic.
Right, because the law here tells you what you can't do, but it doesn't make any provision for how to provide for safety in those necessary situations.
The next item is cable television franchise law. We've talked a lot about cable franchise in the last couple of months. We would support the state of Kansas considering amending their current cable television franchise law. It would require all television providers to broadcast and require public educational and government PEG channels in high definition. Not sure that that's something that's gonna get any traction or much traction, but it is something that we've talked about a lot here lately. It seems like the cable franchise stuff is really hinging more on federal law at this point, but for sure, if we could allow or provide our PEG information out on high definition, that would be beneficial, I think, to our viewers.
See my gray hair more clearly that way.
And then the last item on the list is transient guest tax, and basically we don't want the state to take away our ability to impose a transient guest tax, and we don't want them to impose their own transient guest tax.
May I make a comment on the cable thing?
Sure.
I think that, and I don't know the details, but just several years ago, the state took an action that reduced the income from franchise fees from the cable company to our local television.
Yeah, not franchise fees directly. Franchise fees were not affected by that law, but there was another fee that was just a pass-on. So it was an additional dollar amount that was added to the cable bills that went directly to access or media connection. So that did change the income. And what we did here at the local level is we shifted, we kind of boosted up what we gave them out of franchise fee for several years and kind of did that in a stepwise fashion back down to where they're at today.
Thank you.
I think that was 2006 when that law was actually passed. So with that, if there's anything, any additional discussion or something else that you have on your mind that you'd like us to add or put in here, we certainly can do that. And we drew a lot of the public for this riveting discussion.
With respect to the league, I would tell you, I don't know that we disagree with any of their points. There's just so much volume there, and the legislators will receive that anyway. In terms of things that we might cover with them in one setting and in a document that we put our name on, we felt like we needed to kind of separate out the high priorities. And my thinking is that we would additionally then kind of prioritize them as we go to meet with them in City Hall Day and make sure that we stress the things that are the most important.
Do we have any local folks who are chairs of?
Stephen
important
Johnson's probably the
committees?
most influential in finance and budget. He has a really good informed perspective in terms of what the issue is and the likelihood of something being successful as it relates to taxation and sales tax rate. And then he's very involved with putting the budget together and can be influential there. J.R. Clays, I don't know from a committee chairmanship perspective, but he's very active in terms of project funding more so than, he seems to be effective in that way more so than legislative chairmanships.
And these documents are useful to them. I was an intern at the State House, and these guys don't have a secretarial staff. They don't have staffers. They might get an intern, and they might have one admin assistant for 4 or 5 of them. So having a 1-page or a couple-page document that they can say, okay, this is how the city of Salina feels about this, it is useful to them to be able to pick it up. You don't want it to be too long or too in-depth, because then it gets kind of bogged down. But if they have a 1-pager or something they can look at, okay, this is how we should feel on this agenda or this item, this is what the city thinks, it is useful to them.
And then as legislation goes through, the league keeps an eye on it, and they'll send out legislative alerts and have points of contact, especially, and they'll pay attention to, whose legislator is on the committee and the chairmanships, and they'll send out urgent bulletins on legislative updates topic by topic. So that'll be another opportunity for us to weigh in.
So who's going to spend every Tuesday over at the people?
There are a few larger communities that have paid for lobbyists, but we've never done that. We rely on the league, and then we try to rely on our relationships topic by topic.
Well,
Thank you, Jacob.
is he good?
Okay.
Will?
We will take your guidance and turn this into feedback for the chamber, as well as bring you back a document that you can ratify, and we'll share that with our legislators. And then there are a couple different functions. There's it kind of comes off as a chamber function, but Westar and Evergy, in addition to City Hall Day, have sponsored a tour bus to the Capitol and to meet with different department secretaries and have an opportunity to meet with our legislators then as well. So there's about 3 different opportunities that we can interface with them in a formal way.
Guaranteed to be snowing on one of those.
Yeah, that's right.
Did last
Do we
year.
have dates for those?
I don't know them off the top of my head. Jacob, do you know if the chamber's got their dates?
I don't think they have a date.
Okay.
Well, we have some time, a little bit of time. Speaking of dates, any further news on trip to Garden City?
I put
or
Lauren in touch
invitation.
with their point of contact and indicated our interest and that we need to put a group together, but haven't heard any more on date or cost, but it's in the works.
Okay. I guess if we were gonna be their beta test group.
Yeah, they indicated
Cost
their
should be
plan
like
was
real
to do
low.
it in the spring. So, well, with respect to cost, they offered to do it at a reduced cost. So I don't know if they have, some resources that they want us to cover, and I assume we'll have to take care of our own lodging if it turns into an overnight thing. But the intention was to get a representative group so that it's not just city staff, but involves the stakeholders, and then try to get something coordinated with them that works time-wise. So I'm assuming they wanted to do their regular program in the spring, so I'm guessing after the Christmas holiday, and weather permitting, we'll try to get something set up.
Wow, which would it cost to charter a plane to Garden City?
Depends on the group. We'll see how big the group gets. But I do want to be sure to be, appropriately inclusive there, because I think there is a little bit of angst about models and whether that model works for Salina. And the last thing I want to do is have just a staff contingency go and then come back and report it. I want some direct interaction with those that are going to have an opinion and be the ones to implement it.
Is that a 5-hour drive?
4.
4.
What?
Hard
4 I
4.
can do.
Hard 4.
5 is just mentally tough. Well, we can come back at 3:45, I guess.
That'd probably be the best, in
Since
case other
we've
people may
advertised
plan to.
3:45 is that time, so we'll just take a 20-minute
Right.
break. All right, well, it's 3:48, so we'll open it up for citizens forum. Yes, John, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you. I was wondering about if you had any comments about the climate change movie and that, the public discussion event. That was Thursday. I just wanted to recollect that what came out of the government group, what I heard coming out of it was the need to build community, which was kind of a surprise and I thought really good. And it kind of was an echo of the hackathon event, which was last spring, where there were 80-some or so people there. And we were talking about, that was the common theme at hackathon, was needing to build community. But anyway, I was wondering if you had any comments on that event.
For those of you who don't, Kansas was when there was a movie called From
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, Paris to Pittsburgh,
Yeah, I was kidding.
and about our lack of efforts to sustain the earth. And after the movie, there were 3 discussion groups: government, education, and faith-based initiatives. And I found it very interesting that towards the end of the government group, those issues that we had discussed, lack of family togetherness, consumerism, lack of that identifying will as to what we want as a population, all started really going more towards faith-based. Things you'd expect to come out of the faith-based group were coming out of the government group, because there's only so much you can legislate. And you can legislate some things over the top, and people, they get used to it, and eventually it changes their behavior. And if that's the only way to do it, fine. And my 7 8 years, you get it, behavior change. But there were some simple suggestions, initial steps, in addition to having a sustainability commission, committee, or group, which we had talked about a couple of weeks ago. Someone did ask if the city recycles in its offices. And I actually gave an incorrect answer, and I'll get you to correct me, Jake. I said, no, I don't think we do, just judging by what we have historically collected in this room. But Mike did tell me that the offices do.
Yeah,
Correct.
there is a, you can recycle paper, so there is a place to do that, but it's not a broad citywide thing. So some people may have a recycle, I have a recycling bucket in my office where I put paper and then I take it with the bigger bucket down the hall. I think a lot of people do that, but it's not a.
But we don't have formal places for cardboard, plastics, at least 1 and 2.
I think it's paper.
Paper and cans. I mean, which would be the easiest things to collect. Because it would certainly be, a nice step if we set the pattern and recycle it ourselves.
Someone did mention the city setting policy and example.
Right, be an example. Another question is about budgetary, say cuts, but budgetary adjustments to not just reduce expenses, but reduce energy expenditures, by any means necessary. We talked about, I think Jason floated this idea several years ago. We didn't get much traction, but whether the city could actually power its own buildings with renewable energy sources.
It might be cheaper now than it was that many years ago.
And I doubt, I don't have any discussions on it, but might be something worthwhile.
I'll tell you what, if you ever get a chance, you ought to go. I worked at the school for the last 3 or 4 years over Sacred Heart High School. And of course, Mary Mertz, which is on the, I believe she's on the
She was
committee.
Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, she was, you didn't throw a toothpick on the ground if if Mary was around. I mean, that was the kind of person she was. But, they started out over there with, we've got a certain area that we've had and we maintained, and I helped her maintain the area where, we had the papers and and plastics and then the cardboard, and then, we had it all laid out, and we encouraged the kids to bring it from home, the plastic sacks. We kept the plastic bags even though there was no place we could take them. And then one day, Ken Ritz took them just to get rid of them for us, because, I think we had 35 plastic trash bags full of them, as many as we could get in. They were actually heavy, and Ken took those for us. But, it's... I think there's a whole lot more places in town that really, I think, care about it more than what we really know.
Yeah. So that's what I get. We could certainly be the exemplar and come up with some policies for our own employees and buildings. Of course, after we collect it, still gotta have a place to take it, which is
Take it to the SDRC.
That's right. And of course, they then have to have a place to take it.
Which they still do.
But we can at least get people, I think once you get people thinking about recycling, then they start moving towards the reducing. And that's where the education can come in.
Right.
And people can make free choices. If I can't get rid of plastics 3 to 7, okay, the next 2 weeks I'm not buying anything that's in plastics 3 through 7. Might mean eating a different brand of something. But that's how you mold manufacturers' behavior. But they could probably miss the Salina market and still set record profits. But if it spreads, but you got to start somewhere.
We do.
So, we probably will need suggestions and conversations on how to set up this is a sustainability committee, for lack of a better term, right now. But and highly suggest that it would be county, And needs to include all the different facets of our community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being there and for facilitating that part of the discussion.
It was fun, but I just thought, the government one ended up with the recommendations that you'd expect to get from the church folks, and I don't know what they decided in the faith base. You need more science on this. But education, obviously, is going to be the key to all of it.
If you make it profitable, it's there. That's the problem. There's endless energy out there. I already know where it is, but nobody wants to buy it.
This country's too smart, too resourceful for us to not figure it out.
Those grandkids get excited about Christmas.
That's what we can do, is recycle.
They don't say much.
It makes you clean the water. Put big oil bottom out.
We don't go forward, so.
You'll have to start.
Well, the patent's about up on it here.
Really?
Well, I play Santa for a lot of Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. It's starting to really pour in now. Everybody
Yeah,
wants
witness protection.
everybody wants Santa to visit. Yep.
Way out in western Kansas, nobody will find you.
It's not a huge deal, but in terms of visibility, we are, I think, about doubling the size of, the number of recycling bins at the festival this year. We got some grant funding to be able to buy additional containers, and the Unitarian Church comes in and picks all that up and gets it to another recycling location, but we do quite a bit of recycling at the festival each year.
I was visiting.
Trying to find a way to go to renewable cups and not have trash, but that's 35 vendors, it's a little hard to corral.
Oh, it'd be lovely to ban styrofoam. Start right there.
We have, about half our staff would be all on that and trying to figure out ways to get that done.
Right.
When we were growing up, what year did styrofoam cups start being used? I know we didn't have them when, I don't think we had them when I was a kid.
Late 70s maybe?
And,
70s, early
Where
80s.
did you get your grant from KDHE?
I mean, we did pretty good at picnics.
Propane
I mean,
It's part of other festival and.
Yeah, we're done.
No,
Already?
no notification, public
Well-
hearing, just advertised agenda item.
Yeah.
So if you want to pull it,
we will
there's
recess
one more
outside
with
and
the garage.
pick up in 2 minutes.